Hello everybody and welcome back to passedpawns. Today's video is going to be talking about the terrible opening that the popular League of Legends and now chess streamer Tyler1 used to become a 1900 elo in less than just a year of playing. Now before we actually get into the theory of the cow opening and some of its origins, let's quickly take a look at some numbers. So Tyler1 has been playing for less than a year. He has joined chess.com on July 7th, 2023, and in the last just 90 days he has played over 2,455 games. And that includes 2,148 to 2,150 rapid games. Now, if we just assume that every single rapid game averages out 10 minutes, which is roughly the amount that it does average, this means that in the last just 90 days, Tyler1 has spent over a total of 15 days playing chess, which is obviously a lot of chess. Keep in mind, he hasn't even played a game in 2 weeks. So the fact that he's reached 1900 in less than a year is extremely impressive, but you also have to account for the fact that he spent more time playing chess in this 1 year than most people have in a decade. Now, since Tyler1 doesn't actually play any openings beside the cow opening, which requires very little to no memorization at all, he's been able to spend a lot of this time learning tactics and getting very good, which is why his puzzle rating is an astounding 3,538. This is literally one of the best in the world. Like, many grandmasters have less than 3,500 puzzle rating. It's just an insane rating to get, and it's very, very difficult to get higher than this. So now we got a brief overview of how much Tyler1 actually plays chess. Let's take a look at the cow opening. So the cow opening is very, very simple. Regardless of whether you're playing black or white, you're going to open up with e3 or d3. Doesn't really matter. And doesn't matter what your opponent responds with either, because you're just going to follow up with d3, and you're going to get this interesting development scheme. So you're going to place this knight on e2, and then you're going to place it on g3. Now, obviously, if your opponent starts off with something like bishop g4 here, you could honestly just probably get away with f3, but, you know, the most logical continuation here is just h3, kick this bishop out. If your opponent trades, you're obviously pretty happy here. This is actually very bad for black, and now white is slightly better because white has the bishop pair. But if black retreats, I mean, I don't really see the point of bringing this bishop out to b4 and provoking h3. Not really weakening for white in any way, just a decent developing move. And then you can continue and play knight g3 as you would have normally. So the point is, after something like knight f6, you're going to play knight g3, and then you're going to do the exact same thing with the other knight, place on b3. And the entire idea of this opening is that you can blitz out very quickly. It's primarily designed for things like rapid and blitz and bullet. And this opening was popularized by a chess streamer by the name of Anna Kramling. I'm not sure if she's the one who actually invented the opening. I think she is. Now, anyway, the point is, you're going to develop in a way that kind of concedes the center, so your opponent's going to get a large space advantage, get pretty comfortable, and then you're going to start chipping away at the center. So after something simple like this, where everybody's castled, the position's solid, let's say your opponent plays something like rook e8, here you can already start by chipping away at the center with c4, and that's the whole point, because if you don't ever play c4, or maybe, I don't know, f4, the reason you play c4, by the way, instead of f4, is that f4 makes your king a lot weaker since you're castled kingside. This makes this e3 pawn a big target and vulnerability, and your king just becomes naturally weaker. So you're always going to start finding pawn breaks that are on the opposite side of the way that your king is castled. That's just the best way to do it, because your king stays safer. And c4 is the way to do it. So obviously, if you were playing black and you're castled this way, you were going to play c5. So pawn breaks are very necessary in these sort of openings where you're at a space disadvantage. Now we can bring this back to any Benoni setup where white basically plays d4 and then black immediately responds with c5, basically saying, hey, you can get the space advantage, but I'm going to chip away your center, and your space advantage isn't going to matter. So the same thing can be seen here with c4, basically saying, yes, you have more space than me right now, but it's not going to last for long and it's not really going to matter. And that's basically it. There's not much more theory to the cow opening. It's basically a very, very simple opening, which is why Tyler1 is playing it. He doesn't want to spend hours studying and researching different openings and responses. And instead, he's going to play one simple system that he can blitz out immediately and then use his middle game and tactical knowledge to try and win the game, which is a very good tactic if you're under 2,000 or even under 2,200. As at a certain level, people will be able to fight back against dubious openings like the cow pretty good, and that rating is probably around 2,400. So until then, Tyler1 is probably going to have a very solid opportunity of fighting for higher ratings. Now, this is also not the best way for black to play. Since these knights are on b3 and g3, they're very, very vulnerable and exposed to moves like a5. Basically saying, hey, I'm going to play a4 next, I'm going to kick this knight back to c1, and you're not going to have a good time. Your best response in this case is a4, and then after something like b6 and c4, black is still a lot better, and if black plays accurately, black's going to win the game. Obviously, black has a solid space advantage. Black has the ability to jump this knight into b4, taking up even more space, which can get very uncomfortable for white very easily. However, if we look at the games that Tyler1 plays, they're all rapid games. Tyler1 is a 1900 rapid. He's not a 1900 in classical chess or, FIDE appointed tournaments where the time control was like 30 minutes plus 30 or something like that. Tyler1 is a 1900 in rapid games on chess.com, which are 10-minute plus 0 games. So what this means is the opposing side will have a strategic advantage in which you are worse. However, to be able to convert this in short time control is very difficult. And that's why I said that until 24 or 2300, it's very difficult for players to do this. And you're generally going to find that even a dubious opening like this will still work, just because players will not have enough time to make those moves that will kind of punish this bad opening. Okay, and so now, guys, let's take a look at 2 games that Tyler1 has played with the cow opening at this high level that got him to actually 1900. So this is his most recent game, played on May 13th, 2024. He opens up with d3 in this position. Like I said, e3 and d3 are interchangeable. It doesn't really matter since the setup is the exact same. And he blitzes out this opening in exactly 2 seconds. And what you can notice here is the opponent is playing something like a Queen's Indian. And because Tyler1 is just pre-moving everything, he immediately blunders the pawn on move 5. So by move 5, Tyler1 not only blundered the g2 pawn, he can no longer castle kingside. So at this point, it's already -2, closer to -3. This is a terrible, terrible position to be in, but because this is a rapid game and he's not playing against a grandmaster, he's playing against a 1900, this position is still very much salvageable since the advantage comes in the form of not material, but rather positional advantage, which can be very difficult to capitalize on when you're playing in a low time control. So this bishop goes back to b7. Tyler1 plays bishop f3, trying to offer a trade. Not really sure why queen c8 was played in this position. Probably would have been better for the opponent to just trade bishops here and play something like knight c6, which would have been completely fine. However, queen c8 is played, Tyler1 trades his bishop and then starts to develop. Tyler1 refuses to place this knight anywhere near c3. He's going to stick to his opening principles, which I respect completely. He's going to play knight e2 and then follow it up with e4, closing down the center and locking this queen kind of behind bars, but also expanding in the center. So we get something like d6, a very passive move. Not entirely sure why this was played. I think something like d5 would have already been much better than d6, but whatever. Black's still better, black's up a pawn. Doesn't really matter. So now, logically, Tyler1 prepares to fianchetto this bishop by opening up this b2 square for this bishop, since this knight is obstructing the bishop's development. So this is exactly what happens. We get some development, and now this questionable move a4 is played. Not entirely sure why. I would say it's better to probably just keep it on a2 and then play something like queen e2 and prepare to castle queenside. Although obviously a4 isn't a terrible move, like you're not losing anything, but it's just not necessarily worth it at the current moment. a6, b4. So in my opinion, b4 is currently the most questionable move because this basically makes it even more difficult for Tyler1 to castle queenside now, since now this king is going to be even weaker. But like I said, it doesn't actually matter. This is a rapid game, and so all that matters is that someone's going to eventually blunder, and black can have all the positional advantage in the world, but as long as black makes just one big mistake, it's not going to matter. And this leads me to my next point. The cow opening is very good because nobody has actually ever seen it before. Nobody really plays the cow opening, and so you'll see it maybe 1 in 2,000 games. And when you do see it, you don't really know how to play against it. You're going to spend more time thinking how to develop your pieces properly and how to fight against it. Or if you blitz everything out, you might make a mistake. And so this sort of position is a very unfamiliar territory for Tyler1's opponent, which is obviously beneficial for Tyler1. e5 gets played, black locks in his own bishop. It's an alright move, doesn't really do anything. Tyler1 follows up with knight c4, putting this knight on a more active square. Technically, the engine doesn't really like this move, but as of right now, there's not many better alternatives. And so taking the initiative and being more aggressive is definitely a good thing to do. Even if the engine doesn't necessarily agree with it, it doesn't really matter, since typically you're going to be playing against a human being and not an engine. So being more aggressive could lead to better things, even if it's not the best move possible. And now probably the biggest mistake of the game thus far is made. Tyler1's opponent decides to reroute his knight to f8 for whatever reason instead of just castling, and to probably place on e6. The reason for this, the only one that I can see, is that the knight on d7 can't really jump to f5 because of the b4 pawn. And so Tyler1's opponent decides to undevelop his piece and put himself in a much worse position than he was once a move ago. And now Tyler1 spots an interesting idea with knight f5, although this move is strongly disapproved by the engine because something like pawn takes knight, rook takes g7, f takes c4, let's say, d takes c4, and then knight g6, and now this rook is trapped, and simply king f8 wins this rook. And at this point, this position is completely resignable because king f8 is about to happen. But thankfully for Tyler1, none of this happens, because after he plays knight f5, his opponent plays knight e6, blitzes out this move, thinking that this reroute is simple enough. And what we notice here is Tyler1 3500 puzzle chess rating comes into play, where he sacrifices this knight for the d6 spawn, and his opponent resigns. Obviously, if the spawn took this knight, there would be this queen king fork, and the game would be over anyway. So what did we learn from this game? If you're under 23-2400, your opening choice literally doesn't matter. Excluding blunders, Tyler1 played possibly the worst possible opening, and yet he was still able to come away with a win. Literally 5 moves in, white is left without a g2 pawn and can no longer castle kingside. This position is miserable. There's no center control. This bishop is stuck inside. It's just a miserable position. Did this matter? No, because literally like 15 moves later, what happens? Tyler1's opponent blunders his queen. And this is a byproduct of not knowing what to do with your pieces, because this position is just not familiar for Tyler1's opponent. And all the strategic advantage that black once had quickly diminishes at the sight of this beautiful king and queen fork. This position, despite being better for black, has a 53% win rate for white, which is quite surprising given that this is labeled as one of the worst openings, which we can see obviously doesn't matter in lower time controls and lower elo. So if you're a person who doesn't like to study theory, you can just play something simple and just try to have fun with it, because as we can see, Tyler1 is literally living proof that you don't need large theoretical knowledge to be good at the game. And moving on to game number 2, I wanted to showcase one game for white, one game for black. So let's take a look at this one. His opponent opens up with e4, Tyler1 plays e6, and we get normal development, except for e5. Now e5 right away is already not the greatest move, just because it overextends his pawn for basically no reason. White is still better in this position, but not by a lot, because his pawn is going to be a long-term weakness, because it's overextended. So we get e4. Now here bishop g5 is played, not entirely sure why, but after bishop e7, white decides to trade this bishop off and let Tyler1 develop his queen. This is just another small inaccuracy that really helps even out the game. Now still, white is better because these knights are awkwardly placed and there's a big space disadvantage, but long term, these things are going to start hurting white more than they're going to help. Queen e2 is played, castles, castles, and we get b6. So b6 with the idea of bishop b7. Now here Tyler1's opponent decides to play queen e4. Queen e4 is a one-move threat. It attacks this rook, but it doesn't really do anything else. It just forces the rook to go to b8. And it's kind of a useless move, because after something like bishop d3, Tyler1 actually develops with tempo with bishop b7, forcing this queen to get out of the way and basically, undoing everything that the queen did in the last move. So the queen goes back to e2. Now this is possibly the worst square that the queen could have retreated to. e3 or e1 would have simply been much better, but what e2 does is it allows this knight to jump into f4, forking the bishop and the queen, forcing the queen to go to somewhere like d2. If the queen decides to jump to e3 or e1, then simply knight takes g2, and black is significantly better in this position. And even if queen d2, knight takes g2 is the same thing, so knight takes g2 gets played as well. Here you can notice that this knight cannot be immediately attacked because this knight is actually hanging. And so after something like bishop e4, where a bunch of traits happen, you can simply retreat back to knight h4 here, offer a trade of pieces, and if anything, rook g1 isn't entirely scary, just because you can play g6 at some point, and all of white's attacks get, basically thrown out the window. Now, unfortunately, this didn't happen. Now, Tyler1 still finds a very decent move. He takes this knight with the intention of taking this pawn and winning a pawn, just because now he's able to have an extra pawn. So, as we can see here, if white was to take this pawn, knight takes, and this position is very, very good for black. White spots that, and obviously take this knight. However, what white failed to notice is that this f takes g6 move is a possibility, forcing this queen to move out of the way, winning a tempo, and wherever the queen goes, this pawn can still take, and Tyler1's still going to be up an entire pawn. Now, one thing I will say though is that this whole sequence did happen with f takes g6, except queen e3 was played. But one thing I want to point out is that here queen g5 would have been a slightly better move, just because after something like rook d2 or king b1, you can still play the exact same thing. It's just the queen is on a slightly better square, and that's basically it. But this doesn't really matter, because Tyler1 ends up taking this pawn, and he's now up a clean pawn. His pawn structure is kind of ruined, so I guess not entirely clean, but this position is looking very good for Tyler1. He has managed to not only equalize, but he's actually slightly better now. Here Tyler1 plays c5. c5 is a normal looking move. I would say probably slightly better to play knight c5. The whole point being is that this pawn is now defended, and this knight is just on a more active square. And if something like b4, you can play knight a6, attacking this pawn, a3 for example, and now c5 is very good, because obviously either going to win a pawn, or if this trade is to occur, you could either take with the knight and then just have a great knight, Or you could even take with the pawn and open up this rook and try to attack the queen. Tyler1 played c5, which is a normal looking move. Force the rook out of the way. Now here white finds a clever move with knight d5 because black is not able to take this knight since the queen is pinned. So black has to go queen d6. Rook d1 is played, once again with the idea of, let's say, just a random move is played like h6. Knight f6 check, whatever happens now, let's say the rook takes. This rook is going to take the queen, and Tyler1 would have lost the game. But Tyler1 does spot that, and he finds the only move in this position, which is queen c6. And simply a couple of moves later, the biggest mistake of this game happens, where white just blunders the rook. Queen d6 offers a queen trade, which honestly, even if this queen trade would have occurred, this position is still fine. Honestly, slightly better for black. However, it simply blunders this rook. Tyler1 spots that, and this game is pretty much over. A couple of moves later, Tyler1 trades as many pieces as possible, simplifies it to a very easy endgame, and gets a resignation from his opponent because his pawn is one step away from promotion and stopping is impossible. And the only way to stop it is to sacrifice this knight, and then at that point you're down like 8 points of material, just not worth it. And Tyler1 wins yet another game using the cow opening. This game was a little bit more balanced in the sense that black didn't have an immediate disadvantage like in the first game. Black was just slightly worse because of positional lack of space. But besides that, Tyler1 found an incredible way to win this game. And even before the blunder, he was already winning. He was just up a pawn at this point. And it goes to show that even with the cow opening, if your tactics are on point and you feel like you can outplay your opponent in the middle game, something silly like a cow opening is completely fine, and you're still going to be able to gain elo. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings me to the end of this video. Hope you guys found this video useful or enjoyable. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.